How do you lose $50,000 in under 6 months and still call yourself a financial advisor? I asked him, my voice steady but edged with venom. Across the table, he shifted uncomfortably, his silk tie suddenly looking like a noose. He didn't know that the money he deburned wasn't just a portfolio. It was bait, a carefully set trap for a man I had considered for the stewardship of my entire $15 million estate. His face told me everything I needed to know. Arrogance, excuses, and none of the accountability I demanded. It hadn't started like this, of course. When I first walked into his glass-walled office downtown, I was just another client in his eyes. A retiree, perhaps, or maybe an old man dabbling with savings he couldn't afford to lose. He gave me that charming grin, well-practiced, toothy, confident, that I imagined sold dozens of hesitant investors on his services. "Mr. Halstead," he said, offering a firm handshake, "I'm not just about growing wealth. I'm about securing your future. You've worked hard for your money. Let me make it work harder for you." I smiled politely, letting him think he was the one doing the fishing. "I have a small sum I'd like you to manage. 50,000. Nothing extraordinary, just a test of sorts." His eyes gleamed then. 50,000 might not be much to him, not compared to some of the whale accounts he bragged about, but the way I phrased it, the word test, put a spark of hunger in him. He leaned forward in his leather chair, elbows on the polished oak desk, the faintest smell of cologne mixing with the sterile scent of freshly vacuumed carpet. "A test, you say? Well, I think you'll find I thrive under pressure." I leaned back. "Good. Then thrive with this." And so it began. At first, he did everything right. Weekly updates, slick charts with green arrows pointing upward, and a voice so smooth over the phone it could have been piped in from a Wall Street commercial. He bragged about his strategies, how he wasn't like those other brokers chasing quick highs. No, he was about sustainable growth, minimizing risk, safeguarding the nest egg. "You'll thank me in a year," he told me over lunch at a quiet steakhouse where he insisted on picking the wine. "Conservative moves now, bigger gains later. That's the smart play." I nodded, swirling the Cabernet in my glass. "And you're confident you can manage that?" "Confident?" He laughed, dabbing his lips with a cloth napkin. "It's what I do. Trust me, Mr. Halstead. This 50,000 will be the easiest money you've ever made." Trust. That word always struck me as dangerous when it came from a man who earned commission. By the third month, the updates grew thinner. His emails shrank from cheerful paragraphs to curt bullet points. The charts had less green, more red. Losses explained away with jargon. Temporary setback. Correction in the market. Unforeseen volatility. When I called, his tone wasn't as smooth. "These things happen, Mr. Halstead. You have to look long-term. We're just weathering a storm. But storms don't sink ships unless the captain is asleep at the wheel or drunk on his own arrogance." One evening, I stopped by his office unannounced. The receptionist hesitated before letting me in. I caught him at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, staring at multiple monitors streaming red numbers. He looked younger then, boyish almost, stripped of the bravado he wore like armor. "Rough day?" I asked, stepping into the room. He glanced up, startled, then forced a smile. "Just turbulence, nothing more. The market always rebounds." I walked slowly around his office, running my hand along the bookshelf filled with unread finance tomes, the framed certificates, and glossy photographs of him shaking hands with men in expensive suits. "Tell me something, Jacob," I said, using his first name for the first time. "When you lose other people's money, do you sleep at night?" His jaw tightened. "With respect, you hired me to manage risk, not to eliminate it. That's impossible. Any investor worth their salt knows that. And yet you pitched me safety," I reminded him. "Growth with caution. No gambler's tricks." He exhaled sharply through his nose, irritation bleeding through. You're focusing on the wrong thing. This is about the bigger picture. Market's correct, portfolios dip, but over time, the trajectory is up. Trust the system. I studied him for a long moment, letting silence hang heavy between us. Then I smiled faintly and said, "We'll see." By the 6th month, the 50,000 had dwindled to barely 30. The final meeting was in a cafe, of all places. He suggested it, as though a casual environment might soften the blow. I sat across from him with my coffee untouched, listening to him spin the story. "It's the tech sector," he explained, hands waving. "No one saw the downturn coming, but if we just stay the course—" I interrupted, my voice cutting sharp. "You've already failed the test." He blinked, confused. "What test? The 50,000 was never about money. It was about seeing how you handle responsibility, trust, and stewardship. I was considering you to manage something much larger, 15 million to be precise." His mouth opened, then shut again. His hands, which had been animated moments ago, fell still on the table. He looked like a man who had just watched his future evaporate in front of him. "You're lying," he whispered, though his tone carried more hope than conviction. I leaned in, eyes locked on his. "Do I look like a man who wastes time with lies?" His face drained of color. I stood, sliding a small envelope across the table. Inside, a final statement of the portfolio he'd destroyed. "You had your chance," I said, "and you squandered it. Consider the door closed." I left him there, staring at the envelope, his coffee growing cold, his empire of confidence crumbling like sand beneath a tide. What he never knew was that the money meant nothing to me. The real investment was in finding someone worthy of my legacy, and he had just proven, beyond all doubt, that he wasn't. The question that lingered, though, wasn't about him. It was about me. Because if men like Jacob couldn't be trusted, who could? And so my search began anew. I didn't sleep well that night. The city hummed outside my penthouse window, neon lights washing across the walls, but my mind was elsewhere. Jacob's face, the sudden collapse of his swagger, kept replaying like a broken reel. I had seen it too many times before. Bright young advisors who thought charm and bravado could hide incompetence. Men who could pitch dreams but never protect realities. I walked through the quiet halls of my home, portraits of my late parents staring down at me with stern eyes. They had built their fortune with grit and patience, in industries where sweat and steel still meant something. I was the steward of their legacy, and though I had multiplied it tenfold, I felt the weight of their silent judgment every time I risked it in the hands of another. "Who deserves it?" I murmured aloud, stopping in front of a large oil painting of my father. "Who won't turn 15 million into ash?" The next morning, I met with Eleanor, my attorney of 30 years. A sharp woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled tight into a bun and glasses that could cut through pretense faster than any scalpel. She had been with me through every trust, every foundation, every revision of my will. If anyone knew my frustrations, it was her. "Another one failed," I said, sliding Jacob's final statement across her desk. She skimmed it, her lips tightening into a thin line. 30,000 left. Predictable. I warned you about these young sharks, Charles. They talk faster than they think, always chasing performance bonuses instead of principles." I sighed. I thought he might be different. "You always think that," she replied, setting the papers down. "And you're always disappointed. Maybe you're looking in the wrong place." I arched an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning?" She leaned back, folding her hands. "You keep testing brokers and advisors, men and women who live and die by market swings, but perhaps the person worthy of your estate isn't one of them. Perhaps it's someone who understands stewardship, not speculation." Her words lodged in me like a splinter. I had been so focused on finding a financial mind, I hadn't considered a different kind of mind. Later that week, I drove out of the city, away from the marble towers and glass facades, into the quieter stretches where life moved slower. My destination was a small community center I had funded years ago but rarely visited. A shelter, really, part of my philanthropic endeavors. The building wasn't much to look at, brick and peeling paint, but inside it pulsed with something money couldn't buy: resilience. The director, a woman named Grace, greeted me warmly. She was in her 40s with tired eyes but a smile that carried strength. "Mr. Halstead," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "it's been too long." "I thought I'd see how the place is running," I replied. "I've heard good things." She chuckled. "Good things don't keep the lights on, but yes, we're managing." I walked through the halls with her, watching volunteers serve meals, children working on homework in a corner, an old man reading quietly in a chair that had clearly seen better days. Grace ran it all with quiet efficiency, moving from person to person with words of encouragement, handling crises with calm, stretching every donated dollar until it screamed. "What you do here," I said as we paused near the kitchen, "requires more than bookkeeping. It's stewardship, responsibility, care." She gave me a sidelong glance. "And patience. Nothing grows overnight here. You plant seeds, wait, and hope." That night, as I drove back into the city, I couldn't shake her words. Patience, seeds, hope. Jacob had none of those. But Grace, she carried them like armor. The following week, I called her into my office. She sat across from me, looking out of place among the polished wood and glass. "I have a proposition," I said, leaning forward. "What if I gave you $50,000 to manage as you see fit? No strings, no restrictions, just stewardship." She blinked, clearly startled. "50,000? That's, Mr. Halstead, that would cover almost a year of our operations." "But why give it to me directly? Why not just donate through the foundation like before?" "Because I want to see what you do with it," I replied simply. "Call it another test." Her brow furrowed. "I'm no investor. I don't gamble on Wall Street." "Good," I said, smiling faintly. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If you trust me with it, I'll make sure it changes lives." And as she left, clutching the envelope I had placed in her hands, I realized this experiment was unlike the others. It wasn't about charts or markets or portfolios. It was about something far rarer: character. The thought chilled me and thrilled me all at once. Because if Grace passed this test, she wouldn't just inherit money. She would inherit everything. Grace didn't touch the $50,000 right away. That was the first sign I noticed. With Jacob, the money had been shoved into positions almost immediately, traded like chips at a casino. Grace, on the other hand, asked for time. "I want to think carefully," she said when we spoke on the phone a week later. "This isn't just money, it's lives. Every dollar is a meal, a blanket, a night of safety. I can't waste it." Her words lingered in me longer than I expected. I'd spent decades surrounded by men who saw numbers, not people, profit, not patience. To hear her weigh the human cost of each bill made me realize I had been searching in the wrong arenas. 2 weeks later, she invited me back to the shelter. I found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, directing volunteers as though she had been born for this. She spotted me in the doorway and wiped her hands on a towel. "Mr. Halstead, Charles," she corrected herself with a sheepish smile. "I've put your funds to work. Not in one big project. That's too risky. I split it." "Explain," I said, folding my arms as I leaned against the counter. She led me through the building, explaining as we walked. 10,000 went into repairing the roof. Winter's coming, and leaks destroy more than plaster. Another 15 into expanding the food program. Hunger's the first enemy here. The rest I've divided into smaller targeted uses: after-school tutoring, job placement support, medical checkups. Nothing flashy, but it's the little things that keep people afloat. "And accountability?" I asked. She handed me a folder neatly organized with receipts, projected budgets, and impact reports she had already started compiling. "I don't gamble, Charles," she said firmly. "I plant. The return isn't in percentages. It's in lives stabilized, people moving forward." As she spoke, a young boy tugged at her sleeve. He couldn't have been more than 10, with oversized glasses sliding down his nose. "Miss Grace, I finished my homework," he said proudly, holding up a notebook full of shaky handwriting. She knelt down, ruffling his hair. "Well done, Alex. You're getting better every day." I stood there, silent, watching the interaction. No staged smiles, no speeches, just genuine care. It struck me harder than any market chart ever had. Later, when we sat down in her cramped office, I asked her the question that had been forming in my mind. "Why do you stay here, Grace? You're educated, capable. You could be earning 6 figures in a corporate role. Why devote your life to this?" She leaned back in her chair, considering. "Because I know what it's like to be on the other side. I grew up in places like this. My mother worked 3 jobs. My brother and I bounced around shelters. Someone cared enough to help us, and it changed everything. I promised myself I'd give that back. Money's useful, sure, but without integrity, it's just paper." Her voice was steady, her conviction undeniable. And in that moment, I knew she had something Jacob never would: purpose. Over the next 3 months, I watched her transform the shelter with the funds. Efficiency improved, services expanded, lives stabilized. She never once called to boast, never sent glossy presentations to impress me. She simply did the work, and every time I visited, I saw proof. Meanwhile, Jacob sent me a desperate email. His firm had noticed the losses, clients were pulling out, and he wanted one more chance to prove himself. I deleted it without reply. One snowy evening, I returned to the shelter unannounced. The halls were warm despite the cold, laughter echoing from the dining area where families shared a hot meal. Grace spotted me and came over, cheeks flushed from the heat and work. "I didn't expect you tonight," she said. "I wanted to see for myself," I replied. "And I have another question." She tilted her head. "What's that?" "What would you do with $15 million? Her eyes widened, and for the first time since I met her, she looked uncertain. 15 million? Yes. I kept my gaze steady. Not 50,000, not a grant, the entirety of my estate. Imagine it were yours to manage. Not for you, but for the people you serve. What would you do? She sat down heavily on a nearby chair, her hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she looked up, her eyes clear. "I'd build something that lasts beyond me. Housing, education, healthcare. Pillars, not patches. I'd make sure no child here grows up the way I did, and that no family falls through the cracks just because they're poor. 15 million. It wouldn't just help. It would change everything." Her answer was raw, unpolished, but true. I studied her quietly, the weight of my decision pressing on me. I had tested markets, brokers, advisors, and they all failed. But here sat a woman who never sought wealth, who saw money not as power, but as responsibility. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. I knew then that my father's stern gaze from the portraits would finally soften. I had found my heir. The days that followed were unlike anything I had expected. I thought Grace would retreat into thought, perhaps overwhelmed by the scale of the responsibility. Instead, she moved with purpose, as though she had been preparing her whole life for this moment. She requested meetings, not with bankers, but with teachers, doctors, contractors, and city officials. She wanted to understand the machinery of the city from the ground up, not from behind polished boardroom tables. She carried a notebook everywhere, scribbling ideas, drawing plans, asking questions no broker had ever bothered to ask. How much does it cost to keep a child in after-school tutoring for a year? What are the long-term savings of preventative health care versus emergency visits? If we invested in vocational training, how many people would actually secure jobs within 6 months? She wasn't building castles in the sky. She was building blueprints of a future grounded in numbers that had faces behind them. I accompanied her once, sitting quietly as she met with a group of single mothers at the shelter. "What would make the biggest difference in your lives?" Grace asked them, her tone gentle but firm. One woman spoke up. "Affordable childcare. If we had that, we could work without worrying if our kids are safe." Another added, "Housing that doesn't eat half our paychecks." A third whispered, "Health insurance, just basic, so we don't have to choose between rent and medicine." Grace listened, nodding, writing each word down. When the women finished, she looked at me. "There it is, Charles. That's the roadmap. Not Wall Street portfolios, not speculative gains, real lives." Something in me shifted then. For decades, I had thought in terms of numbers, how to grow them, how to preserve them, how to pass them on. But Grace saw money as a tool, not a treasure. And for the first time, I began to believe my estate might actually matter beyond my own name. Still, Eleanor wasn't entirely convinced. She visited me one evening, storm clouds brewing over the skyline, and placed a stack of papers on my desk. "You're moving fast, Charles," she warned. "Too fast. Have you considered the risks? She's untested at this scale. Noble intentions don't guarantee sustainability." I sipped my scotch, studying her with tired eyes. And yet the tested ones, all those advisors, firms, and financial architects, they squandered trust every time. Grace hasn't. Eleanor pursed her lips. "Intentions are one thing. Infrastructure is another. How do you know she won't be overwhelmed?" "Because she already carries the weight of lives every day," I said quietly. "And she hasn't buckled yet." Eleanor sighed, removing her glasses. "You're staking everything, Charles. Not just money, but your legacy. If she fails, I interrupted, "then at least the attempt was honest. Better an honest failure than a polished fraud." The conversation ended there, but her doubts stayed with me. They weren't without merit. Grace's heart was vast, but could it withstand the ruthless grind of bureaucracy, politics, and vultures who would circle the moment they smelled money? I found my answer sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, Grace invited me to a community forum she had organized. The room was packed. Families, city officials, journalists. At the front, she stood alone with a single microphone and a hand-drawn chart taped to the wall. No fancy presentations, no hired consultants. She outlined her vision: affordable housing units funded by a rotating trust, a healthcare clinic built on preventative care, child care programs integrated into community centers, vocational training partnerships with local businesses. Every plan was tied to numbers she had verified herself. Every projection linked to real families she had spoken with. When questions came, they weren't easy. "How do you ensure accountability with $15 million?" a reporter demanded. "By publishing every expenditure online, down to the last cent," Grace answered firmly. "What about corruption in city contracts?" another asked. "Then we bypass them," she replied. "We hire local. We audit everything. We empower the community to hold us accountable." The crowd murmured in approval. I watched, struck by how unflinching she was. Grace didn't cower before tough questions. She faced them with clarity and humility, the very qualities absent in every financial advisor I had ever tested. As the forum ended, a young man approached her, no older than 20, his clothes ragged but his eyes bright. "Miss Grace," he said nervously, "if you build those training programs, I'll be first to sign up. I don't want a handout. I just need a chance." She smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's exactly why we're doing this." And in that moment, I understood. Eleanor's fears of failure were not misplaced, but Grace was already winning battles that no balance sheet could measure. That night, as I looked out over the city, I felt something I hadn't in decades: hope. But I also knew something else. When word spread about what I was planning, predators would come. The same kind of men who had burned my 50,000 would circle Grace like wolves. And if she was to inherit my estate, she would need more than vision. She would need to learn how to fight. The first hints of trouble came not from Grace herself, but from the whispers Eleanor brought me. "Word's out," she said grimly one afternoon in my study, dropping a thin manila folder on my desk. "Someone leaked the news that you're shifting your estate. Now the sharks are circling." Inside the folder were clippings and printouts, sleek investment firms sending interest letters, city politicians proposing partnerships, even Jacob, that arrogant fool, trying to insert himself back into my orbit with a thinly veiled apology letter. They weren't drawn to Grace's vision. They were drawn to the scent of money. "She'll be swarmed," Eleanor warned. "And Charles, they'll eat her alive if she's not prepared." I stared at the papers, my jaw tightening. Eleanor wasn't wrong. Grace had courage, compassion, and determination, but the financial world was a nest of vipers. They'd exploit her kindness, twist her trust, and bleed her dry if I let them. That night I paid a visit to the shelter without warning. Grace was in her office, poring over plans, her desk buried in notes and sketches. She looked up, surprised but pleased. "Charles," she said, pushing her glasses up, "what brings you here?" I closed the door behind me and sat down. "Predators? That's what brings me here. Word of the estate is leaking. People will come to you with promises, polished presentations, and poisoned smiles. They'll flatter you, try to bind you with contracts you can't escape. And if you're not ready, they'll bury you." Her expression hardened. "Then I'll tell them no." "It's not that simple," I said. "They'll disguise themselves. They'll offer things that sound useful, connections, influence, even legitimacy. They'll make you believe you need them." She leaned back, arms crossed. "So what do I do?" I hesitated, then said what had been forming in my mind for weeks. "You learn how to fight, and I'll teach you." Her eyes widened slightly. "You?" "Yes. I've been dealing with these men my whole life. I know their tricks, their games, their greed. If you're going to carry this fortune, you need to know how to defend it. Otherwise, everything you've built will crumble the second I'm gone." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded slowly, determination settling into her face. "All right, teach me." And so it began. Our sessions weren't about kindness or compassion. She already had those in abundance. They were about steel. I showed her how to read contracts for traps, how to spot hidden fees, how to dismantle an overconfident salesman without raising her voice. We role-played meetings, me as the predator, her as the defender. "Notice the language," I told her during one exercise, sliding a mock proposal across the table. "They'll bury a single clause on page 27 that gives them control of the purse strings. That's the hook. Tear it out and the whole thing collapses." She read carefully, then circled a section in red ink. "Here, this line about performance incentives, that means they skim off every gain before we ever saw it." I smiled faintly. "Good. You're learning." Other days I tested her resolve. I'd make offers that seemed irresistible only for her to find the rot underneath. "You're offering me a 20% return," she said once, narrowing her eyes at me. "That's too good to be true. If it looks like magic, it's a con." "Exactly," I replied. "Never trust the man who promises the moon." But it wasn't all about defense. I also taught her offense, the art of negotiation, the ability to shift power in a room without brute force. "Silence," I told her, "is your weapon. Let them talk. The longer they talk, the more they reveal. And when you finally speak, make every word cut." She practiced, faltered, then practiced again, and slowly I watched the transformation. Grace, the woman of compassion, began to sharpen into Grace, the woman of steel. One evening, after weeks of this, I arranged a final test. I invited a group of real estate developers to a meeting, men who had tried to court me for years. Unbeknownst to them, I wasn't the one they'd be pitching to. When they entered my office, they found Grace sitting at the head of the table, her notes neatly arranged. I watched from the corner, silent, as they began their polished presentation. Charts, projections, promises of partnership. Their smiles gleamed like knives, but Grace didn't flinch. She listened, eyes cool, then began to ask questions. What's your contingency for rising interest rates? How do you justify this hidden management fee? Why does your risk assessment exclude worst-case scenarios? With each question, their smiles faltered, their confidence cracked. By the end, they were stammering, retreating under the weight of her calm dismantling. When they left, defeated, she turned to me with a small smile. How was that? I couldn't help but laugh. Grace, you were ruthless. She straightened her papers, her expression firm. I had a good teacher. In that moment, I knew the wolves would still come, but they would not find an easy meal. Grace was ready. What neither of us knew, however, was that Jacob, bitter, desperate Jacob, hadn't vanished quietly. He had been watching from the shadows, nursing his humiliation into something darker. And soon, he would make his move. Jacob's move came sooner than I imagined. It was late spring when Eleanor called me, her voice tight. Charles, I've just received a notice from the state attorney's office. A formal complaint's been filed against your foundation. Allegations of mismanagement, fraud. I felt the blood rise in my temples. Fraud? That's absurd. Who filed it? She hesitated. Jacob. Of course. The coward hadn't vanished. He had regrouped, sharpening his bitterness into a blade. He claims, Eleanor continued, that you've diverted funds through shell accounts. He's provided fabricated documents to support it. Normally, I'd laugh it off, but the state has to investigate. And once it's public, the wolves will howl. I paced the room, fury clawing at my chest. The man burns 50,000 of my money, and now he thinks he can drag me into the mud? No, he won't win. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Charles, listen to me. They'll come after Grace, too. If your estate plan becomes public while this investigation is ongoing, she'll be painted as part of it. They'll say she manipulated you, that she's unfit, that she's just another grifter in your orbit. That hit me harder than the fraud itself. Grace, the woman who stretched every dollar into dignity, being smeared in headlines alongside Jacob's lies. I couldn't allow it. That night, I went to the shelter. Grace was in the common room, reading a story to a cluster of children curled at her feet. Their laughter echoed through the hall like bells. She looked up as I approached, concern immediately crossing her face. Charles, you look pale. What's wrong? I told her everything. The complaint, the investigation, Jacob's schemes. As I spoke, her expression shifted. Not fear, not despair, but something harder. Resolve. Then we fight, she said simply. I blinked. Fight? Grace, this isn't a boardroom debate. This is politics, law, the press. They'll twist everything you stand for. She stood, her voice steady. Then we give them the truth before Jacob gives them lies. We go public. We show the receipts, the programs, the impact. We put everything in the open. No secrets, no shadows. I stared at her. It was bold, reckless even, but it was also brilliant. Jacob thrived in shadows. He couldn't win against sunlight. Within a week, Grace organized what she called a transparency summit. She invited journalists, community leaders, donors, even skeptical politicians. In the largest hall the shelter could rent, she stood on stage with binders full of receipts, photographs, testimonials. This is what $50,000 did, she declared, holding up a ledger. Meals served, roofs repaired, families housed, and if anyone doubts it, here are the people whose lives were touched. One by one, families stepped forward. a mother who had found stable housing, a teenager accepted into college, a man proudly holding the keys to his first steady job. Their stories weren't statistics, they were flesh and blood. I sat in the front row, watching as Grace dismantled Jacob's smear with something no courtroom trick could counter: truth. And yet, the real test came during the Q&A. A sharp young reporter stood and asked, "Ms. Moore, critics say you're manipulating Mr. Halstead, that you're positioning yourself to inherit millions under the guise of charity. How do you respond?" The room fell silent. Grace took a deep breath, meeting the reporter's gaze. "I never asked for a cent," she said firmly. "Charles entrusted me with $50,000. I used it to serve people in need. If he entrusts me with more, I'll do the same. If he doesn't, I'll still be here tomorrow, still fighting, still serving, because this isn't about money, it's about people. If you want to question motives, question the ones who stand to profit, not the ones feeding children." The applause shook the walls. The next morning, headlines told the story, not Jacob's, but Grace's. Shelter director defends legacy with transparency. $50,000, countless lives changed. Jacob's name barely appeared, except in context of disgraced advisor or former broker accused of false claims. Eleanor called me that afternoon, her voice lighter than I'd heard in weeks. "Well, Charles, she just turned a smear campaign into a coronation." I looked out at the city skyline, a strange pride swelling in me. Grace hadn't just defended herself, she had proven she could defend the estate. And yet, I knew Jacob wouldn't stop here. Men like him never slink away quietly. They bide their time, looking for weaker ground to strike. The problem was, he didn't realize that every attack only tempered Grace's steel. And soon, she would no longer need my protection at all. Jacob did not vanish. He lingered like smoke, curling through cracks where vigilance faltered. 2 months after the Transparency Summit, when the investigation had officially cleared me and Grace of any wrongdoing, Eleanor delivered a new folder to my desk. She dropped it with a thud, her lips pressed into a hard line. "He's gone underground," she said. "Started a consultancy firm under another name. I've traced it through shell companies. Guess what his latest business model is?" I flipped through the papers. Promises of high-yield philanthropic investments. Smooth brochures with photos of smiling families, a slogan splashed across the top: "Profit with purpose." My jaw tightened. He's copying Grace. Eleanor nodded, except his purpose is his own pockets. He's targeting small charities, churches, even neighborhood programs, convincing them to invest in his schemes with the promise of doubling their impact. It's fraud waiting to happen, but he's smart enough to stay just inside the law. I exhaled slowly. The thought of Jacob bleeding the very communities Grace fought to protect made bile rise in my throat. "We can't let him get away with this," but Eleanor shook her head. "If you go after him directly, it becomes personal. A vendetta. It'll drag your name back into the mud." I looked out the window. The city sprawled beneath me like a board game. "Then Grace will have to handle it." And so I called her. When she arrived, I laid the brochures across the table. She studied them carefully, her brow furrowing. "He's preying on people who don't have the resources to defend themselves," she said, anger sharpening her voice. "He's not just greedy, he's cruel. Which is why you must stop him," I told her. "Not with force, with something stronger." Her eyes flicked up. "Truth?" "Yes, but not just truth, strategy. You'll need to outplay him, not just outshine him." Grace nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then show me how." The next weeks became a different kind of training. Together, we built a counter-offensive, not in courts or markets, but in the hearts of the very communities Jacob was circling. Grace launched a campaign called Trust with Transparency. She partnered with small organizations, teaching them how to read contracts, spot red flags, demand accountability. At the workshops, she would hold up Jacob's glossy brochure and say plainly, "If anyone promises you returns that sound too good to be true, walk away." Real impact doesn't multiply overnight. It grows steady, like roots. The message spread like wildfire. Churches passed it along, local leaders endorsed it, even the press picked it up. And then came the blow Grace had been waiting for. One of Jacob's clients, a small church on the south side, had been convinced to hand over nearly their entire building fund. But before Jacob could close his grip, the pastor called Grace. She arrived with lawyers, community members, and cameras. In front of everyone, she confronted Jacob. "You call this profit with purpose?" she said, holding up his contract. "All I see are hidden fees and escape clauses. You're not building futures. You're stealing them." Jacob's smirk faltered as the cameras rolled. "This is slander," he snapped. "These people chose to work with me." Grace's voice cut sharp. "They chose because you lied, and now they choose to walk away." The pastor tore the contract in half. The crowd erupted in applause. The footage hit the news within hours. Community leader exposes fraudulent consultant. Jacob's name was dragged through every gutter he had tried to crawl out of. I watched it all unfold on the evening news, a quiet pride swelling in my chest. Grace hadn't just defended herself, she had defended others. She had done what I always hoped my estate would do: protect the vulnerable. Later that night, she came to my penthouse, tired but triumphant. She sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "Do you think he's finished?" she asked. I poured her a glass of water and handed it to her. Men like Jacob never finish. They scheme until the day they die. But you don't need to worry about him anymore. Because today you didn't just stop him, you proved you can stop anyone like him. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. "Then maybe I really can carry this legacy, Charles. Not just the money, but the fight that comes with it." I smiled faintly, my chest tightening with something between pride and relief. "You already are, Grace." But as I looked out over the city, its lights flickering like restless stars, I knew something she didn't yet. My time was growing short, and the moment was approaching when the estate would no longer be a test. It would be hers. The signs of my decline came quietly at first. Missed steps on the marble staircase, a shortness of breath I dismissed as age, a trembling in my hand when I tried to pour a drink. I hid it well, or so I believed. But Eleanor, sharp as ever, saw through me. "You don't have forever, Charles," she said during one of our evening reviews of the estate papers. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but her eyes softened. "If you want Grace to inherit more than money, if you want her to inherit your legacy, you must finalize everything now. No more tests, no more waiting." That night I sat in my study long after Eleanor left, surrounded by ledgers, deeds, photographs of towers I'd built and charities I'd funded. And it hit me with a force I hadn't expected. All of it. Every skyscraper, every dollar, every polished contract was temporary. But if Grace carried the torch, perhaps the flame would outlast the steel. I called her the next morning. "Come to the penthouse," I said simply. "Bring no notes, no binders, just yourself." She arrived in her usual modest coat, looking slightly out of place against the high glass and gold trim. I guided her to the library, where Eleanor already waited with a thick envelope. "What's all this?" Grace asked, glancing between us. I took a deep breath. "This is the moment I stop testing you. My estate. 15 million, the companies, the properties, the foundations, it's all formally yours. Effective the day I'm gone." Her eyes widened. "Charles, no, this is too much. I can't." "You can," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I felt. "Because you already have. You've proven that money doesn't sway you, that people matter more than profit, that you can withstand wolves and liars. I've waited my whole life for someone like you, Grace, and now I can rest, knowing the future isn't in the hands of men like Jacob." She sank into a chair, tears welling, her voice breaking. "You trust me that much?" "More than I've trusted anyone," I said. "You're not just the heir to my estate. You're the heir to my fight." Eleanor slid the envelope toward her. "This contains the legal confirmation. All it requires is your acknowledgement." Grace hesitated, then placed her hand on the envelope as though it were something sacred. "If I accept this, Charles, I swear to you it won't die in banks or portfolios. It will live in homes, in children's futures, in hope." I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of her words sinking deep. My father had built with steel, my mother had guarded with prudence. But Grace, she would build with compassion, a foundation stronger than stone. From that day, things moved quickly. Eleanor set up the trusts. Grace began drafting long-term projects with architects and city planners. The press speculated endlessly, but Grace ignored them, pouring her energy into designs for housing blocks, schools, clinics. And then, one evening, she stood on the balcony of my penthouse with me, the city stretching endlessly below. "You know," she said softly, "I don't think this is really about inheriting from you." I turned to her, curious. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "This is about carrying you forward, your parents, your work, your values. You're not leaving this city behind, Charles. You're becoming part of it forever." Her words stilled me. For the first time, I felt peace. Not the shallow peace of wealth preserved, but the profound peace of knowing that what I'd built would matter after I was gone. But as the wind whipped across the balcony, a cold truth settled in my bones. The time was closer than anyone knew. And soon, Grace would face her greatest test yet, without me beside her. The end did not arrive in one swift blow, but in a slow, undeniable unraveling. I could feel it in the mornings when rising from bed required more effort than I cared to admit. And in the evenings, when the lights of the city blurred before my eyes like fading stars. Grace noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "Charles," she said one afternoon, finding me in the library slumped in an armchair, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. "You've been pushing yourself. Let me take more of this on. Please." I gave her a tired smile. "You already carry more than I ever dreamed anyone could. But some things a man must finish himself." She shook her head gently. "No. Some things a man must trust others to finish." Her words cut straight through me, and I realized with startling clarity the torch had already left my hand. In the weeks that followed, I retreated from the world, not out of defeat, but out of preparation. Eleanor finalized the documents. Grace pressed forward with her plans, meeting contractors, city leaders, donors. She no longer needed me at her side to hold steady. She stood taller now, her voice sure, her resolve unshakable. One evening, I asked her to walk with me through the shelter grounds. It was winter, the air crisp, children chasing each other across the yard as snowflakes drifted lazily down. She greeted them all by name, her warmth a fire against the cold. "Look at them," I whispered. "Every one of them proof that money isn't numbers. It's survival. It's hope." Grace turned to me, her eyes glistening in the soft glow of the street lamps. "Then we'll make sure your 15 million becomes hope for generations, Charles. That's my promise." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from me. "Then I can go in peace." The end came quietly. In my sleep, the city lights twinkling outside my window one final time. When the news broke, philanthropist Charles Halstead passes, leaves entire estate to community shelter director, the world roared with speculation. Some scoffed, calling it foolish. Others lauded it as visionary. But Grace did not waste a moment defending herself in words. She defended herself in action. Within a year, ground was broken on the first Halstead homes, affordable housing units built with dignity, not decay. A clinic followed, then a vocational training center, then a child care program woven into the very fabric of the community. Reporters who had once doubted her came to film the ribbon cuttings. Politicians who had circled like vultures now lined up to take credit. But Grace never lost sight of what mattered. She stood at each opening ceremony, her voice steady, her gaze unyielding. "This is not my legacy," she said. "This is Charles Halstead's, and it belongs to the people." Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, told me once in those final days, "If you choose wrong, Charles, your name will vanish with your wealth." But she was wrong. Because through Grace, my name did not vanish. It became something greater. And as the city grew, as children laughed in the halls of schools my fortune built, as families laid their heads on pillows in homes that bore my name, the truth was undeniable. I had not simply left an estate. I had planted a seed. And Grace had made sure it grew into a forest no flame could consume. Years passed, and the forest grew. Halstead homes expanded into entire neighborhoods, rows of clean, sturdy apartments filled not with desperation, but with the hum of ordinary life. Children spilled out into courtyards, bicycles clattering over pavement, mothers calling them in for dinner. The clinic bustled with nurses and doctors who charged nothing to those who couldn't pay. The vocational center turned out electricians, mechanics, teachers, chefs. Men and women who once thought the city had no place for them now built its very bones, and through it all, Grace remained the steady flame at the center. She refused lavish offices. Her desk stayed in that same cramped room in the shelter, papers stacked high, the hum of the kitchen audible through thin walls. But her influence stretched across the city. Politicians sought her endorsement. Universities invited her to speak. Donors begged to contribute. She took their money, yes, but only on her terms. Transparency, accountability, impact. There would be no Jacobs under her watch. Eleanor, though older now, still visited often. I imagine her smile the first time she toured the Halstead Academy, a school built entirely from the estate. Children waved from classrooms with bright murals, their voices raised in songs that echoed down polished halls. "You did it, Grace," Eleanor told her, voice uncharacteristically soft. "You turned his fortune into a living monument." "Even I couldn't have imagined this," Grace shook her head. "We did it. Charles gave me trust. You gave me guidance. I just carried the torch." But privately, when she returned to the penthouse, her one concession to a life outside the shelter, she would stand at the balcony and speak to the night sky as if I were still there. "Are you watching this, Charles?" she whispered once, her hands gripping the railing. "Do you see what your seed has become?" And if I could have answered, I would have told her yes. Yes, I saw. Every brick laid, every hand lifted from despair, every child who laughed without hunger gnawing at their belly. I saw it all. Jacob's name, meanwhile, rotted. His firm collapsed under investigations he couldn't escape this time, his schemes too brazen, his enemies too many. The last I ever heard of him, he was living in a rented apartment under another name, bitter and forgotten. He had been a test, and he had failed. Grace was the answer. 10 years after my passing, on the anniversary of the first Halstead home opening, the city unveiled a statue in a new public square, not of me alone, but of two figures, one an older man, hand outstretched, the other a woman, younger, standing beside him, holding a book in one hand and a child's hand in the other. The plaque read, "Charles Halstead, who built with steel, Grace Moore, who built with hope." Together they gave a city back its future. Grace stood before it that day, children clustered around her legs, reporters thrusting microphones toward her. She said only one thing. "This isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning, because every child here will carry it forward." That's how legacies live, not in statues or fortunes, but in the lives we lift. The crowd erupted in applause, and in that moment, I knew the truth beyond any doubt. I had thought I was searching for someone to manage my estate, but in the end, what I found was someone who made me immortal. Grace never slowed. By the 20th year after my passing, her hair had streaks of silver, but her voice was still strong, her step still quick. The city around her was transformed in ways even I hadn't dared to dream. Halstead homes dotted not just one borough, but 5. The clinics had grown into a network of community hospitals. The vocational program had become a pipeline that fed directly into the city's industries, lifting thousands out of poverty. And yet, despite the scale, Grace never let go of the small things. She still walked the halls of the original shelter every week. She still remembered names, birthdays, and stories. She still sat in cramped offices with nervous mothers, struggling teenagers, recovering addicts, and listened, truly listened, as if no empire had grown beneath her hands. But the world beyond the city had noticed. Foundations called. International leaders invited her to speak. She was nominated for prizes, her name mentioned alongside saints and reformers. Still, she deflected the spotlight. "This is Charles Halstead's legacy," she told the cameras. "I'm just its caretaker." Yet in quiet moments, I think she knew the truth, that she had taken the spark and turned it into a blaze far brighter than anything I'd envisioned. One evening, standing on the same balcony where she had once asked if I was watching, Grace looked out at a skyline forever changed. Towers I had built now standing beside schools and homes she had raised. She leaned on the railing, her hands weathered from decades of work, her gaze steady. "You see, Charles," she murmured to the night, "your fortune didn't just build buildings, it built futures, and it will keep building long after I'm gone." A soft wind stirred, carrying the sounds of the city, the laughter of children, the echo of construction, the hum of life reborn. If there is a way the dead can answer, mine would have been a whisper carried in that wind. "Yes, Grace, I see it all." When she finally passed, years later, the city grieved as though it had lost its mother. Her funeral filled the cathedral to bursting. Politicians, workers, children she had once fed, now grown into men and women who brought their own children to say goodbye. But more powerful than the ceremony were the ripples she left behind. The Halstead Moore Foundation, as it was now called, had been structured to outlast both of us. Its funds locked, its mission written in stone, its leadership chosen not from bankers or politicians, but from the very communities it served. No Jacob could ever touch it. No vulture could ever gut it. It was eternal. And so the story ended not with me, nor even with Grace, but with the countless lives lifted because 2 strangers had met over $50,000, a sum so small, yet it revealed everything. The foundation expanded far beyond the city. Branches appeared in other states, then other countries, each one modeled on the same principles of transparency and stewardship that Grace had embodied. Clinics in rural towns, schools in forgotten corners, shelters in war-torn places where hope had all but vanished. The name Halstead became synonymous not with wealth, but with trust. Every anniversary of the first shelter's founding, bells rang across the city. Crowds gathered in the square, lighting candles beneath the statue. Some came to honor the past. Most came to celebrate the future. The lives changed, the dreams realized, the proof that legacies could be more than names carved in stone. And yet, even as the world grew, the heart remained small and human. In the original shelter's common room, a faded photograph still hung on the wall. It showed a man in a tailored suit shaking hands with a woman in a modest coat, the two of them standing in front of a building with peeling paint. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "The day a seed was planted." Generations later, a little girl stood beneath that photograph, clutching her grandmother's hand. "Who are they?" she asked. Her grandmother smiled softly. "That's Charles Halstead. He had money. And that's Grace Moore. She had heart. Together they changed everything." The child stared at the photograph, wide-eyed. Did they build this place? No, her grandmother said, kneeling so their eyes met. They built hope. And hope built this place. Outside, the bells tolled. And in every peal, in every echo across the city, across the world, one truth remained unshakable. What began as a test of $50,000 had blossomed into an eternal covenant. Charles Halstead's fortune, Grace Moore's vision, a legacy that could never be lost because it lived on not in wealth, but in people. And so the story did not end. It continued, generation after generation, as long as hope found a home. Years later, long after my name and Grace's had been etched into history, the foundation faced its greatest trial yet. Not from a Jacob, not from fraud, but from time itself. The world had changed. Technology reshaped economies, cities expanded, crises grew global. Climate displaced millions, and poverty no longer looked the same as it had in my day. The question arose, whispered first in think tanks, and then shouted in boardrooms, could the Halstead-Moore model survive the century? The answer came not from bankers or politicians, but from a young woman named Sophia, barely 30, raised in the very walls of a Halstead home. She was the granddaughter of a boy once tutored in the shelter's after-school program, the first in her family to graduate college. Now she stood before the Foundation's council, eyes bright, voice steady. We've spent decades lifting people from poverty, she said. Now we must face the next storm. Climate, migration, technology. If we don't adapt, we'll become a monument, not a movement. But if we carry forward Charles's seed and Grace's vision, we can plant hope where the world thinks it cannot grow. The council listened. Some doubted, as they always did, but Sophia pressed on, laying out plans as bold as Grace's had once been. Solar-powered housing projects, floating schools for flood zones, digital literacy programs that reached into villages once cut off from the world. And just as Grace once had, she demanded transparency, accountability, and above all, human dignity. Her words spread. And soon, across continents, the Foundation became more than a network of clinics and homes. It became a force of resilience against the world's greatest storms. In the square where our statue stood, people gathered again, not just from the city, but from across the globe. They laid flowers, not in mourning, but in gratitude. The plaques had been updated. Charles Halstead, who built with steel. Grace Moore, who built with hope. Sophia Delgado, who carried both into the future. The little girl who once asked her grandmother, "Who are they?" returned years later as a woman, her own children tugging at her sleeves. She pointed to the statue and said softly, "That's our inheritance. Not money, not buildings, but the proof that one life, one decision, can change the course of the world." And somewhere, if spirits linger where legacies live, I felt Grace beside me once more, watching as the seed we planted grew into something neither of us could have ever dreamed. Because what began as a test of 50,000 had not just endured, it had become eternal. And the story still wasn't finished. It never would be. So long as there were lives to lift, the legacy would live on. Another 50 years passed, and still the roots deepened. The Halstead-Moore Foundation had outlived its founders, its doubters, its predators, and even its first heirs. It had grown into something beyond us, a living organism, vast and adaptive, stretching across continents like veins of hope. In the city where it all began, the square had become a pilgrimage site. The statue of myself, Grace, and now Sophia stood at the heart of it, not draped in dust or forgotten ivy, but surrounded by gardens, benches, and the laughter of children. Tourists came to take photos. Locals came to remember. And every year on the anniversary of that first shelter's founding, bells still rang, echoing the promise forward. But the most striking sight was the new generation of leaders. They weren't bankers or politicians. They weren't chosen for charm or eloquence. They were chosen the way Grace had been chosen, through proof of stewardship. Farmers who had fed villages through droughts, teachers who had raised schools from nothing but chalkboards, doctors who had built clinics with their bare hands. Each of them carried a fragment of the torch, and together they wove it into a flame that lit places our names had never touched. One evening, in the glow of those bells, a young boy tugged at his father's coat. "Papa," he asked, pointing at the statues, "were they kings?" His father shook his head, smiling. "No, son. They were ordinary people. One had money. One had heart. One had vision. Together, they prove that anyone, if they choose rightly, can change the world." The boy's eyes widened, and in them burned the same spark that had once lived in Grace, in Sophia, in every soul who picked up the torch after us. And it was then I understood, from whatever quiet place beyond time I had gone. The story never belonged to me alone. It was never just my test, never just Grace's burden, never just Sophia's future. It was humanity's story, of wealth turned to service, of trust given and not betrayed, of hope multiplied beyond counting. The 50,000 I once placed in Jacob's careless hands had seemed small, almost trivial. Yet it was the key that unlocked all of this, a seed, a forest, an eternal promise. And so the story stretched on, into centuries, into generations unborn, because hope, once planted, does not die. It only grows. Centuries later, when the city looked nothing like the one I once knew, the legacy was still alive. Towers of glass and light rose into the clouds, transport hummed silently along magnetic veins, and medicine had conquered diseases I'd watched claim friends in my time. Yet in the middle of that gleaming future, the heart of it all, remained the square, the place where it began with $50,000 and a test. The statue had changed again. No longer just myself, Grace, and Sophia, but now a circle of figures, each added over generations. Ordinary men and women who had carried the torch in their era. A farmer from Africa who turned deserts into green with irrigation funded by the foundation. A doctor from India who built floating hospitals for climate refugees. A teacher from Brazil who created schools in the favelas that rivaled any academy in the world. Each one was carved in bronze, hands linked across time, forming a chain that circled around the original figures. Children ran through the space, touching the hands of the statues as though they were family. Their teachers told them the story not as history, but as inheritance. Charles gave the seed, Grace nurtured it, Sophia carried it, and each of you one day will decide whether it grows. By then, the foundation no longer bore a single name. It was simply called the Covenant. It operated in every corner of the planet and even beyond, funding the first habitats on Mars, ensuring no colony repeated the mistakes of greed and neglect that had once plagued Earth. And yet, its headquarters remained in that city, in that square, next to the shelter that still stood, preserved as a monument but still in use, still serving meals, still giving warmth. Its walls bore photographs of every generation of leaders, beginning with Grace's modest coat and my tired smile. One evening, as the bells rang to mark another anniversary, a girl stood beneath the oldest photograph, the one of me handing Grace that envelope. She was no older than 10, with curious eyes and a notebook clutched to her chest. "Who were they, really?" she asked her grandmother. Her grandmother knelt, touching the frame with reverence. "He was a man who thought money was everything. She was a woman who showed him it wasn't. Together they planted hope. And that hope grew into the world you live in today." The girl tilted her head. "Do you think I could do something like that?" Her grandmother smiled. "Child, that's the whole point. The story isn't finished. It's never finished. Every generation gets to write the next chapter." The girl looked back at the photograph, determination already kindling in her young eyes. and I, from whatever place beyond time I had long since gone, felt the truth settle deeper than it ever had before. The estate, the money, the structures, they had all been temporary. But the choice to trust, to plant, to hope, that was eternal. The story would go on, forever. In the end, the truth was simple. Money fades, buildings crumble, names etched in stone wear down with rain and time. But the choice to trust, to give, to build with purpose, that endures. I thought I was testing an advisor with $50,000. In truth, I was testing humanity itself. And humanity, through Grace, through Sophia, through countless others, proved worthy. The estate became more than wealth. It became a covenant, an eternal promise that hope would never be left homeless. That is the final conclusion. A fortune was not the legacy. The people were, and because of them, the story will never truly end.